Globally, competition will always keep moving towards the most advanced, the most quality products, and nobody wants to compromise with their health. Regulatory system strengthening is not anti-industry. Thank you so much for another session. Welcome, and let's have a conversation that is helping us drive growth of Africa's life science industry. For today in this topic, I'm going to talk about regulatory system strengthening as an enabler for local manufacturing of health products and technologies in Africa. From 2005, when the first conversation around pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa, the developments on how the governments and actually the African Union could lead the journey started, the key conversation on was what were the gaps, what was the opportunity, and how could we move the conversation to not be just a conversation, but be a reality and implementable intervention that supports growth of the industry. Fast forward from 2005 when the conversation started, 2009, the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa was conceptualized, and actually the initial business plan development started. Endorsed by the heads of states, we ended up in 2012 with the final business plan, and most importantly, the first intervention towards promoting local manufacturing of health products and technologies in Africa. But not only manufacturing, but also ensuring that products that were getting into the continent met the safety, efficacy, and the quality standards that were aspired for. And that started with the Africa Medicines regulatory harmonization. With the initiative in place in 2012, it started in a confederated manner with the regional economic communities, national regulatory authorities being supported in terms of improving their capability, institutional capability, regulatory competency, and therefore then we're able to collaborate and drive regulatory oversight of our markets. But the essence of this conversation, that is just to lay the foundation of where things are, because subsequently after Africa Medicines regulatory harmonization with the regional economic communities came into place, we moved to the journey where we had these national regulatory authorities now moving towards being mature regulatory authorities. WHO came with the regulatory mechanism under the mechanism of what do we talk about it? Look at it as a global benchmarking tool, the assessment competencies to assess whether regulators were mature enough to oversee the products that were being introduced into those markets. Pharmacy and Poisons Board became a ML2. Subsequently, a couple of other countries, Tanzania became ML3. Ghana, and at the moment as we are having this conversation, we have 9 regulatory authorities across the continent who have achieved maturity level 3. Let's give it context. Maturity levels are benchmarks in terms of the grading of how robust the regulatory architecture of a country is to enable and to protect the public, to enable industry growth, but also to protect the public from any substandard and falsified products in those markets. So what does that look like? Number one, ML1, you have nascent structures. There's nothing really concrete and nothing really defined. There are some countries across the continent from our work in African Pharmaceutical Network where we engage and realize that the regulator is more of a department within the Ministry of Health. It is not an autonomous agency running with its own structures and statutes. Then we move to ML2, where maturity level 2, there's an agency in place. It has some modest level of structures. It can do some work, but there's still room for improvement. Then we move from that level to maturity level 3, where we're saying the regulatory authority has robust structures and governance mechanisms to oversee all the 9 functions of a regulatory authority. And with that capability, therefore, they are mature enough to protect the market in terms of overseeing everything, but most importantly, now are more in continuous improvement to advance to the next level. Maturity level 4 are mature regulatory authorities. All institutional structures are perceived and intended to be in existence, and therefore all they need to do is evolve into new developments. We're talking about precision medicine, we're looking about AI use in regulation. Those are the new frontiers. So at maturity level 4, you're going into the new frontiers and seeing how to put into that place. Then we have WHO listed authorities. Maturity level 4, but they're now at listed level because they've met all the standards and frameworks of what is expected of regulatory authorities to guarantee that any product that gets into their market, there's regulatory oversight, there's guarantee of safety, quality, efficacy, and fitness for purpose when we talk about medical devices and technologies on the other frontier. So this is where the architecture comes in. Why is this conversation important for us to look at it from all that work happening? How does it support local manufacturing? And it's a conversation that needs to happen because in most conversation, most engagement with different players, people ask, as a local manufacturer, because regulatory authorities are strengthening their capabilities, they're now closing our operation, they're now making it difficult for us to trade and operate. True to one extent, But most importantly, we need to understand that when the regulator actually gets upgraded to a particular standard in terms of ML3, ML4, WHO listed authority, it is a stamp of approval that they are competent and capable of overseeing that market. Which means if you are a manufacturer in that country, you are guaranteed that people will trust your product, people will consume your product, and therefore it is a market access strategy. It is enabling you to access markets you would otherwise not have been able to access by the virtue of that. And I'll give a case example of how these have happened. Look at context where products were being manufactured in different facilities, whether they're ML1, ML2, whatever it is, but those manufacturers who believed in quality as an enabler for market access were going for WHO pre-qualification. And it becomes a brand and a stamp of approval where a manufacturer will tell you that by the virtue that I'm WHO pre-qualified, now I can compete in global tenders. That shows you that if not only the WHO pre-Q comes in, but the regulatory authority at the country who sets the foundation or benchmark of every operator in that market has already met those status, you are in a better position working with them, and you're in a better position meeting those standards. So regulatory system strengthening will give you the access to the new markets that you aspire for, and those new markets will be enablers for you to be able to trade as a manufacturer. For the general public, it is also a guarantee that as much as it's strengthening oversight of everything, it's guaranteeing the patient. And when the patient is guaranteed quality products, even the locally manufactured products available in the market will be trusted. And if I trust it, I consume it. If I consume it, that is a market for the manufacturer. And one of the key contexts of conversation that I've had to deal with most cases for some of my engagements across industry is, do we as a people trust our own products in the country that are locally manufactured? Oftentimes we don't trust them, and the reason could be based on the perception of quality concerns or generally wanting quality products, and we believe quality is outside the country. But I've visited more than 10 local manufacturers in this country, and in my visits I can confirm that the quality standards are at par with some of the global standards of what I've interacted with in the developed world. So the question is, why don't we trust them? We don't trust them because less of that communication gets to the public, and these are journeys that we need to see. How do we make the conversation come to the public? But most importantly, we need to build that infrastructure to ensure that there is that trust. The regulatory system strengthening work becomes an enabler for trust, as it should be. When we leave that from a point of market access, trust with the public, customers and everything, regulatory system strengthening and mature regulatory authorities is an enabler for industry, because every time when a manufacturer is producing their products, they must demonstrate quality standards are met. How do they demonstrate quality standards are met? By the stamp of approval from the regulator, which means if a regulator comes to you and they are mature regulatory authority, they evaluate your systems, your capability, your production processes. When you don't meet the standards, they have the technical capability to support you, to work with you, to enable you deliver on what you need to be doing. Which means if you are operating as a very suboptimal level, you will have upgraded to the next level, because the regulator is mature enough and they're able to handhold you and walk that journey with you. But if they didn't have that capability, they were just walking around and doing whatever it is that they can, chances are that technical capability lacks in them. Therefore, they cannot oversee you, and even if they do, they don't know what to look for. That becomes a dying industry, because globally competition will always keep moving towards the most advanced, the most quality products, and nobody wants to compromise with their health. A mature regulatory authority, as I said again, when you look at the different levels, goes beyond routine oversight and performance. One of the key contexts and the key challenges that I see with the markets has been regulatory hurdles, regulatory challenges. Somebody telling you, it takes me more than 3 years, 4 years, or even 5 at times to get my medicine registered in the market. If the regulator is mature enough for them to be benchmarked, to be confirmed to be mature, first, they must have been able to comply with their own service charter. As the Pharmacy and Poisons Board in the Kenyan context, they indicate that their registration timeline should be 24 months, which means if they are to comply with that, that will be an enabler for you to get early access to market for your products. That is already a business incentive, because you're seeing them being able to meet your timelines. When you talk about import permits and export permits, that most of the time for manufacturers, people complain about delays of up to 4 weeks or all that. If the regulator is mature enough, they have to comply with their timelines. They normally say within 8 days. The question is, 8 days will give you 1.5 a week. When looking at it from business days, a mature regulatory authority gives you value as a manufacturer. And on the other end, beyond just that, one of the key things is we will now get to the level of trying to work in new product developments, innovation, research, and different development aspects from a scientific standpoint. That support comes from mature regulatory authorities. And I remember from my previous engagements, reaching out to the regulatory authorities in the UK, the US, you have scientific advisory sessions, scientific meetings. And the scientific meetings, you are developing a new product. The regulator is working with you in that journey to help you know what scientific evidence do you need to generate to ensure that your clinical development addresses the patient needs and the public needs, but also addresses the regulatory concerns. And now when we talk about health technology assessment, having a mature regulator both on the technology assessment in commercial aspect, economic aspect, on this other side in the scientific and the clinical quality aspect, it gives you the technical muscle to say, if I get the guidance from them in the formative phase, use that information to power the growth in the next level, we are at a different level, and that becomes an engine for growth of industry. So one key thing that I'm looking at in this conversation is for us to understand that regulatory system strengthening is not anti-industry. It is pro-industry, but it has to be made to look as such. How does it get made to be pro-industry? It is by industry acknowledging that the benefit and the value that can come out of this, but most importantly, regulators seeing the extra responsibility that they get by virtue of being a mature regulatory authority, and on that account, engaging with industry to support them, to give them the power, to drive that growth to where it needs to be. Because when we all win, we are all delivering for the people and we are all achieving our mandates and our obligations. That is what I feel we need to understand about regulatory system strengthening as an enabler for local manufacturing in Africa, in Kenya, in the region, and all over the world. I would say that. If you enjoyed the conversation, subscribe to the channel, share this video with somebody you think would be able to benefit from it, and let's make the conversation reach as many people as possible, and most importantly, make a difference in guaranteeing that each of us, wherever we are, has access to safe, effective, and quality health products and technologies when and where we need them. Thank you, and have a good one.